And literally what he did was he raped me. And he did it every week, at least once a week, until the time I was 18. My father, whom I was supposed to be able to trust, who was supposed to keep me safe, raped me a minimum of 200 times before I became 18. One of the things I remember that was probably one of the most disgusting to me was when I got old enough to learn how to drive, my father would take me out every Sunday afternoon for a driving lesson. And of all the ridiculous places to take me to do what he was going to do to me was he took me to a graveyard.
Joyce Meyer's story is heartbreaking, to say the least. But it's what she says next that really got me thinking.
God didn't get me out of it, but he did give me the strength to go through it. And listen,
you see, Joyce is an evangelical Christian, right? And she's claiming that God helped her get through the trauma that she had been through. And I know the first question that pops in your head is, well, why would an all-loving God allow for so much evil in the world? And that is a very good question, and I want to make a video addressing that in the future. For right now, you can actually go and check out Frank Turek's video. He gives a brilliant explanation to that question. I'll leave it linked down below. But right now, I want to focus on Joyce Meyer, okay? Because with her, either one of two things can be true. It's either God did in fact help her get through the trauma that she had been through, or Christianity is simply a coping mechanism for people like Joyce. It isn't actually true. It's just something that you tell yourself to make yourself feel good. And believe it or not, okay, there actually is a way to legitimately investigate this.
That the only way any human being on this earth will ever be saved is through Jesus Christ.
In order for Christianity to be true, three things need to have happened. Jesus needs to have died on the cross, he has to have claimed to be God, and he has to have proved to us that he's God by rising from the dead. Okay, so now let's look at the evidence. Did Jesus actually die on the cross? We actually have access to both Christian and non-Christian sources that say that Jesus did in fact die on the cross. The annals of Roman historian Cornelius Tacitus, written about 116 AD, state that Christ suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Roman Emperor Tiberius under the hand of Roman governor Pontius Pilate. He goes on to say that a mysterious superstition, aka the resurrection, broke out starting in Judea and eventually spreading all the way to Rome. Okay, so far, this checks out perfectly with what we find written in the New Testament. But that's not all. We also have a Jewish historian named Josephus writing in the Antiquities of the Jews. And he says that Christ was indeed crucified under Pontius Pilate at the instigation of some Jewish leaders. And yes, it is important to point out that there are some interpolations in Josephus' writings, and these are actually highlighted by Dr. Yamachi in Lee Strobel's book, The Case for Christ. Yamachi points out that even if we remove all the interpolations from Josephus' writings, we're still left with a historical Jesus who was the martyred leader of the early church in Jerusalem, and he was a popular teacher who established a wide and lasting following even though he had been crucified. Again, perfectly in tune with what we find written in the New Testament. Now we know that it is reasonable to think that Jesus did in fact die on the cross, but did he rise from the dead?
The conclusion that the resurrection of Jesus Christ is either one of the most wicked, vicious, heartless hoaxes ever foisted on the minds of human beings, or it is the most remarkable fact of history.
Moreover, the followers of Jesus were Aramaic-speaking peasants from Galilee.
So there's a few things we know about early Christianity. First thing being that Jesus did in fact die on the cross. The second thing being that Jesus' followers all genuinely believed that they had seen him risen from the dead. Now obviously just because they believed that they had seen him risen from the dead doesn't automatically mean that he actually had risen from the dead, but we know that they sincerely believed it. This is quite important because we see the resurrection completely changed the lives of all of the 12 disciples, okay? Peter, being the leader of the 12 disciples, denied Jesus 3 times out of fear that if people found out that he was associated with Jesus, he would get in trouble. And yet this same Peter ends up being killed for his faith. Okay, we see in 1 Clement chapter 5 that Peter was martyred in Rome under the Roman Emperor Nero around 64 AD. Okay, so we know that the disciples genuinely believed that Jesus had risen from the dead. The third thing we know about early Christianity is that even Jesus' enemies and people who weren't originally his disciples also began to believe that they had seen him risen from the dead. Now, who exactly am I referring to here? Firstly, I'm referring to James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul, or Saul of Tarsus as it were. James, the brother of Jesus, didn't believe in Jesus during his lifetime. We read in the Gospel of Mark that Jesus' family was saying that he was out of his mind. So initially, James, the brother of Jesus, didn't follow Jesus. It wasn't until after the resurrection that we see James becoming the leader of the church in Jerusalem. And eventually James was also executed for his faith. We read in the Antiquities of the Jews, book 20, chapter 9, that James was killed in Jerusalem. And what about Saul? Okay, who's this Saul guy? Well, Saul of Tarsus was actually a Roman citizen and a Jewish Pharisee. Okay, one of the chief leaders of the Jews. This man would go around hunting and even killing Christians. Not only that, but Saul was a student under the great legal teacher Gamaliel. Saul of Tarsus was a highly educated, highly ranking, and highly respected member of Jewish society. And yet this man is willing to throw away everything he's ever worked for. This man goes from being a Jewish Pharisee to becoming a tent maker, okay, a blue-collar worker. This man is willing to go to his death time and time again for something. For what? Well, he claims that it was because he has seen the risen Jesus. Okay, taking all those facts into consideration, what do non-Christian scholars have to say about all of this? Well, the most common explanation you'll hear from non-Christian scholars is that the disciples simply hallucinated the resurrected Jesus. Okay, they hallucinated it because the disciples loved Jesus so much that he appeared to them after his death. Okay, similarly to how your grandma might die and then she'll appear to you after she has died. Let's test this hypothesis for just a moment. Firstly, this reasoning absolutely does not explain whatsoever why Jesus' tomb was empty. And well, I know now you might be thinking, well, Onta, how do we know that his tomb was empty? How do we know that Jesus was even buried in a tomb? Well, firstly, the earliest historical manuscripts that we have concerning the life of Jesus all say that he was buried in a tomb. Secondly, we know that the Roman Empire allowed for crucifixion victims to be buried after they had been crucified. Okay, we read in the Digesta compiled by Roman Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, the bodies of those who are condemned to death should not be refused their relatives. At present, the bodies of those who have been punished are only buried when this has been requested and permission granted. And sometimes it is not permitted, especially where persons have been convicted of high treason. Even the bodies of those who have been sentenced to be burned may be claimed, in order that their bones and ashes, after being collected, may be buried. It goes on to say that the bodies of persons who have been punished should be given to whoever requests them for the purpose of burial. Thirdly, we know that it was part of Jewish customs to bury people immediately after they had been executed. We read in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 23. You must not leave his body on the tree overnight. Be sure to bury him that same day, because anyone who is hung on a tree is under God's curse. You must not desecrate the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. The Jews would have buried Jesus immediately after he was crucified. And yes, sometimes Jews refer to the cross as a tree. We actually read in Acts chapter 10 that the Apostle Paul says that Jesus was killed by hanging on a tree. And as if that isn't enough, we actually have archaeological evidence of a man named Jehohanan who was buried after being crucified. And all of this would have taken place in the 1st century. Okay, it would have taken place roughly around the time of Jesus. This next part of the video is actually really important, so I just wanted to change the setting a little bit. We know that there were people living in the first century that absolutely hated Christianity. The easiest way for the Jews or the Romans to absolutely destroy Christianity would have been for them to just simply dig up the body of Jesus and be like, hey, you see, we have his body right here. He hasn't been raised from the dead. Okay, but we don't see any of that happening. What we instead see are the Jews claiming that their disciples stole the body. Okay, which means that they're admitting that the tomb was empty. They're just trying to say, oh well, the reason why it's empty is because the disciples stole the body. Similarly to, let's say, if your teacher asks you, where's your homework? And you respond by saying, oh well, the dog actually ate my homework. You're basically admitting that you don't have your homework. You're just trying to say, well, the reason why I don't have my homework is because the dog ate it. Okay, that's exactly what's happening with the Jews. Okay, they're admitting that the tomb is empty, but they're saying, oh well, the reason why it's empty is because the disciples stole the body. The idea that people somehow hallucinated the risen Jesus just makes no sense, because we know that this is not how hallucinations work. The earliest historical sources say that up to 500 people saw Jesus risen at the same time. And according to psychologist Gary Collins, hallucinations are private occurrences in the mind of an individual. By their very nature, only one person can see a given hallucination at a time. Hallucinations aren't something that can be seen by a group of people. Neither is it possible that one person can somehow induce a hallucination in someone else. Since hallucinations can only exist in this subjective, personal sense, it's obvious that many people cannot hallucinate the same thing. And also, when you just look at what Paul is saying here, he's saying that many people have seen the risen Jesus. You can go and talk to them and ask them for yourselves. They will tell you that they have seen the risen Jesus. And last but not least,
why in the world would Paul have hallucinated the return of Jesus?
Okay, he didn't love Jesus or follow him during his lifetime. Why would this guy, of all people, suddenly start hallucinating the risen Jesus? The disciples would have had absolutely no reason whatsoever to steal the body of Jesus. We see that these people are tortured and threatened with death time and time again. They weren't getting paid to start spreading this lie that Jesus had now suddenly risen from the dead. It would have been way easier for them to just forget about this whole Christianity business and carry on living their regular lives. And yet these men are willing to go to their deaths time and time again, claiming that they have seen the risen Jesus.
These men were willing to die for the fact that this man had risen. Again, that doesn't mean he had actually risen, that we're not there yet. But it does mean they sincerely believed it, because liars make poor martyrs. People aren't going to die for a lie or something that they know is false. Of course, people die for things that are false all the time, but not things that they know are false.
And even if the disciples had stolen the body of Jesus, that still doesn't explain why Saul of Tarsus is claiming to have also seen the risen Jesus. Some people, although not many scholars, seem to think that this whole idea that Jesus rose from the dead is actually just a myth that developed over time. And the problem with this is that you actually do have scholars such as Gary Habermas, Michael Licona, and Craig Bloomberg, who refer to 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verses 3 to 8 as a pre-Pauline creed. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also, as of one abnormally born. They refer to this as a pre-Pauline hymn or creed. And they say that this creed developed within 2 to 5 years after Jesus' death. Okay, 2 to 5 years. Now, I know you might be wondering, well, why did they say this? Paul converted to Christianity roughly 2 to 3 years after the death of Jesus. And immediately, he was ushered into Damascus by a Christian named Ananias and met up with other disciples. Paul could have been given this creed around then. A few years later, Paul met up with Peter and James in Jerusalem to discuss the gospel message and whether he was preaching it correctly. Scholars point out that this could have been another time that Paul could have been given this creed. Even atheist scholars such as Paula Fredrickson and Bart Ehrman admit that the creed we see in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verses 3 to 8 is really early. Some scholars such as James D.G. Dunn say that this creed developed within months after the death of Jesus. Okay, now we're talking months. Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence is strongly in favor of the Christian faith. We have excellent reason to believe that Jesus did in fact rise from the dead. Did Jesus claim to be God? This is quite an important issue because many people will say that Jesus never even claimed to be God. In order for us to really get into this, we have to look at the most reliable historical biographies that we have concerning the life of Jesus. I'm referring to the 4 Gospels. The 4 canonical Gospels are not only the earliest biographies we have concerning the life of Jesus, but they were also written by eyewitnesses or by people who knew eyewitnesses. And when we say the Gospels are early, we mean that they were written during the lifetimes of people who would have existed around the time of Jesus. So let's say the Gospel of Mark, which scholars often say is the first of the 4 Gospels. Let's say Mark was written in 70 AD. Okay, that's just 40 years after the death of Jesus. So if someone was 20 years old when Jesus died, they would now be 60 years old when the Gospel of Mark was written. And we do know that there were people who lived up until a ripe old age. We know that Polycarp, someone who existed in the 1st century, lived up until his 90s. But I'm willing to argue that the Gospel of Mark was written way earlier than 70 AD. You see, Luke, the same Luke who would have written the Gospel of Luke, also wrote the book of Acts. And Luke tells us that he wrote the book of Acts after he wrote the Gospel of Luke. The book of Acts kind of ends unfinished. You see, Paul is kind of like the main character of the book of Acts, and the book ends with Paul being under house arrest in Rome. The book of Acts tells us nothing about Paul's execution, probably because Luke finished writing the book before Paul was executed. In fact, we don't even read about Peter, the leader of the 12 disciples, or James, the brother of Jesus' execution, anywhere in the book of Acts. The book was obviously written before the central figures of the early church were executed. We know that Paul died in 62 AD, which means that the book of Acts cannot be dated past 62 AD. Having established that, we can now work backwards from there. Since Acts comes after the Gospel of Luke, we know that the Gospel of Luke must have been written earlier. And since Luke incorporates aspects of the Gospel of Mark, we know that the Gospel of Mark must have been written even earlier than that. And according to Dr. Craig Blomberg, if you allow for a 1-year time gap between the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, and another 1-year time gap between the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Mark, we can date the Gospel of Mark to about the late 50s AD, which means that roughly 30 years after the death of Jesus, we already have the Gospel of Mark. And a little while after that, we now have the Gospel of Luke. And in ancient history, 30 years is not a long time. The first biographies of Alexander the Great that we consider to be reliable come 400 years after his death. And again, the earliest biographies of Roman Emperor Tiberius that we consider reliable come almost 80 years after his death. 30 years for Jesus isn't all that bad, especially once you consider that many people living in the 1st century were illiterate. And it's important to remember that the reason why oftentimes atheist scholars say that the Gospel of Mark was written in 70 AD is simply because they don't believe in biblical prophecy. You see, Jesus' ministry would have taken place roughly either in the late 20s AD or the early 30s AD, right? And during Jesus' ministry, Jesus was able to predict the destruction of the second Jewish temple, which only took place in 69 or 70 AD. And that's why atheist scholars say, oh well, there's no way Jesus could have predicted the destruction of the second Jewish temple. Therefore, the only explanation is that the Gospel of Mark was written after the second Jewish temple had already been destroyed. Like I said, atheist scholars don't believe in biblical prophecy. That's why they reach this conclusion. When was the last time I watched the sunrise? And it's raining outside. I don't know if y'all can hear that, but many people seem to hold this view that we can't trust what the New Testament writers are saying because these people are obviously biased, okay? These people are Christians and they're going to tell you a bunch of Christian stuff because they want you to believe it. So we can't really trust what they're saying. And again, I want to kind of reinstate the fact that the New Testament writers are not just ordinary Christians. These people would have been eyewitnesses to the events surrounding the life of Jesus. Okay, and furthermore, these people literally had zero incentive to make this stuff up about Jesus. Okay, in the words of Frank Turek,
you can't trust the New Testament writers because these people were biased. We'll talk more about this tomorrow, but if you think about that for more than 10 seconds, you realize how dumb that is. Why? What did the New Testament writers have to gain by making up a resurrected Jesus? They're Jewish believers in Yahweh. They had everything to lose by saying Jesus had rose from the dead. Not everything to gain, right? They got excommunicated from the synagogue and then they got beaten, tortured, and killed. That's not a list of perks, okay? So they had everything to lose by saying Jesus rose from the dead. They said he rose from the dead anyway, and then many of them went and died for that when they could have said, hey, don't kill me, man. We're just making this up, right?
okay, this kind of just shows that the New Testament writers didn't really have anything whatsoever to gain from making this stuff up, okay? They had everything to lose, nothing to gain. So the New Testament writers are arguably extremely credible as historical sources because, like I said, these people are at the very least being sincere. Okay, now that we've gotten all of that out of the way, what do the earliest historical sources say about whether or not Jesus actually claimed to be God? Well, the short answer is Jesus obviously claimed to be God. That's why the Jews wanted to kill him, because claiming to be God would have been seen as blasphemy. We see this clearly portrayed in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 14. The high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" "I am," said Jesus, "and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." The high priest tore his clothes. "Why do we need any more witnesses?" he asked. "You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" They all condemned him as worthy of death, then began to spit at him. They blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and said, "Prophesy!" And the guards took him and beat him. Firstly, when Jesus was asked if he was the Son of God, he replied by saying, "I am." And if you actually read the Gospel of Mark, virtually every single time Jesus is asked in a public setting who he is, he kind of responds by saying, "Shh, don't tell anyone." Mark chapter 14 is the only time in the entire Gospel of Mark where Jesus boldly says who he is. In fact, throughout all of the four Gospels, Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man. And there are two sons of man in the Old Testament. Okay, one is seen in the book of Ezekiel, which is a very humble and lowly human figure, right? But then there's a second Son of Man seen in the book of Daniel. And the Son of Man in the book of Daniel is given glory, authority, and sovereign power in heaven. Which Son of Man do you think Jesus is claiming to be? Obviously, Jesus is claiming to be the Son of Man seen in the book of Daniel. If you actually read Daniel chapter 7, it says, "In my night vision I looked, and there before me was one like a Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and people of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed." Now, it's becoming so obvious why the high priest wanted to kill Jesus. And by the way, the high priest that we see in Mark chapter 14, his name was Caiaphas, and we actually have his bones. His tomb was discovered in the southern part of Jerusalem in a place called Peace Forest. Okay, the Gospels aren't talking about fictional characters over here. These are real people who existed in ancient history. If you want an even more nuanced explanation of Daniel chapter 7, the Aramaic word used to describe how people in heaven were treating the Son of Man is palak, which is a word used to worship God. And in the Greek New Testament, as well as the Septuagint, the word latruo is used. And every time the word latruo is used, it's used as a word due only to God. Due only to God. Okay, no human ever receives latruo. Ladies and gentlemen, I've given you at least what I think are the best arguments for Christianity. I genuinely do think that God helped Joyce Meyer get through the trauma that she had been through. And I think that the same God loves you and cherishes you and wants to spend eternity with you. Hey guys, I made a gospel tract essentially just summarizing everything that I've said in this video. So if you have a family member or a friend who isn't a believer and you want to try and share the gospel with them, you can just download the gospel tract. I'll leave a link in the description. It's completely free. Okay, completely free. You can download it and just send it to that non-believer friend or family member of yours, and help spread the gospel. So yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. I had fun making this video. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.